is August 5th, 2024, and the head of Russia's Security Council, Sergey Shoigu, is currently in Iran. Now, while he's meeting with Iranian officials there, the timing could not be more notable because, of course, the entire world is watching Iran right now to see what they will do, how they will respond to Israel. After last week, Israel carried out the assassination of a top Palestinian diplomat and the Hamas political chief, Ismail Haniyeh. Now, of course, Israel doesn't take responsibility for that assassination, but it also came just hours after they targeted a Hezbollah commander by bombing Beirut. So, what will Iran do? And how could Russia be playing a role in not just what they do, but possibly how they respond? As we have reports that Israel is preparing some sort of counterstrike as they already carried out the initial attacks. And apparently they're preparing to respond to Iran's retaliation, even though it hasn't even happened yet. There are also reports of weapon shipments or some sort of military related shipments going from Russia to Iran. So, what do we know about those reports? How accurate are they? And what could this mean for the future of conflict in the region as we continue to see those tensions heat up, all fueled by Israel with the support of the US? Well, we discussed all that and more earlier with a special guest. So, let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is international relations and security analyst Mark Sleboda. Mark, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Rachel, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the show.
It's always good to have you. Now, I want to get your take on the latest here as Russia's former defense minister and current secretary of the Russian Security Council, Sergey Shoigu, is in Iran today for talks with the country's leaders as the world, of course, waits to see how Iran will respond to the assassination of Palestinian diplomat and Hamas political chief Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran last week. What do you see as the significance of not just Shoigu's trip, but also the timing of it?
Okay, so rumor mill time. Let's pretend we're at the water cooler, right?
Okay.
Because this is all unconfirmed. So obviously Shoigu is he no longer the Secretary of Defense. He is now the head of or the chair of the Russian National Security Council, which is probably the most important political body in the country. It's the one that makes the major geopolitical decisions. And a lot of it weighs in increasingly on a lot of domestic decisions as well. But a lot of Western analysts like to refer to it as a new Politburo. Okay, all right. I mean, it's not entirely correct, but not entirely incorrect either. So Shoigu is in Iran, and the timing, of course, is right after the Israeli assumed Israeli assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, the Hamas political chief in Tehran, where he was attending the inauguration of the new Iranian president, Pezeshkian. So, and in response to that, it is widely reported in the Western mainstream media that Iran and its allies in the axis of resistance, Hezbollah, Kataib Hezbollah, Ansarullah, the Houthis in Yemen, and a host of smaller groups, are preparing to launch retaliatory strikes in response at Israel. And conceivably against U.S. military bases and assets in the region as well, because Iran regards the U.S. as complicit in the assassination. It was a huge security blow and humiliation to the Iranian government and to the new Iranian president to have a senior foreign guest killed in their house. Right. So Shoigu will be meeting with the head of his Iranian equivalent, the secretary of the Supreme Security Council of Iran. He will also be meeting personally with the new president, Iranian President Pezeshkian himself. And this coincides, one, of course, the timing, as Iran is supposedly moving military assets into place all over the country in what we are told in the Western mainstream media. And I think this is a fair bet that Iran is about to respond in a big way, a much bigger long-range strike, barrage, or perhaps days of barrage than we saw back in April after that provocation. Now, the rumor mill part of it is that there are reports that there have been a near continuous stream of flights of Russian heavy military transport planes, Ilyushin 76s, to and back and forth to and from Tehran and Russia. And the reports go further. This is being reported in Ukrainian media. It's being reported in Israeli media. It is being reported widely on Russian war correspondent Telegram channels. A lot of chatter, but there's nothing official about this yet. So take it all with a grain of salt, but it is not entirely improbable. Supposedly, Russia is transferring a significant amount of military equipment for Iran before they launch this retaliatory strike, and are expecting a further retaliatory strike from Israel and perhaps the United States. And one of the things, the primary thing in most of the reports that Russia has transferred is the Murmansk BN electronic warfare system. Well, what is that? Okay, so this is perhaps Russia's most powerful electronic warfare system. It's not much to look at. A system is about 10 trucks, and about 7 of them carry very, very large antenna masts that rise up off the truck high into the sky. And then there's a control and an energy truck as well. But these things are positioned over a wide area, and they have a very powerful electronic warfare capability across a whole range of things they can do. Their specialty, though, is the jamming of high-frequency signals that are used for U.S., NATO, and Israeli military communications, particularly with aircraft, say in the air and that sort of thing. But they can also be used for GPS jamming, interception of radio communications. They can seriously aid in the detection, the targeting of stealth fighters and aircraft with tracking incoming missiles and aircraft. As well as spoofing some of the signals that these missiles and strike aircraft will use for launching attacks. So primarily what it is likely to be used for is an added layer of electronic warfare defense in case, assuming, Israel responds to the Iranian retaliatory strike with their own retaliatory strike, or perhaps even, as has been suggested in the Israeli press, a preemptive strike. So they assassinate someone in Iran, and they've also recently assassinated a Hezbollah commander in Lebanon, in Beirut as well. So they respond to that as the opponent gears up for a retaliatory strike with their own preemptive strike to the retaliatory strike, because, Israel. Anyway, this is a formidable system. Reportedly, the range of the Murmansk BN is somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 kilometers. And I had to check it up. The distance between Israel and Iran is somewhat less than 2,000 kilometers, so well within the range of the Raman system. Now, there are other reports, particularly I've seen these in the Israeli press, that Russia has also transferred a number of Iskander ballistic missile systems to Iran. And the Iskander has proven extremely effective in Ukraine. And there are versions of it that have a range of around 5,000 kilometers as well. None of that is confirmed, but it's being talked about in multiple places. And it is all conceivable because Russia and Iran have a strategic partnership that has grown in strength, as is Iran has provided support to Russia's intervention in the Ukrainian civil conflicts since 2022. Drone designs, there are talks about ballistic missiles as well. Not so sure about that, but definitely with some drone designs, which Russia then spun off and made their own equivalent of the long-range Shahed strike drones. The Russian evolved iteration of that right now is the Garan 2 Black. But Russia remembers its friends. And there is open discussion that Russia and Iran are supposed to sign a new, deepened, and strengthened strategic partnership in October. And supposedly that is still on course. And Russia has promised, or shall we say, threatened the United States that if it continues to provide long-range missiles and other strike assets, which it is widely assumed that U.S. personnel are actually targeting for strikes inside Russia, then Russia will retaliate and provide long-range strike capability to U.S. adversaries, which could it very well be considered to be Israel, although it's probably more likely that they're providing the electronic warfare system, at least as a defensive capacity. There have also been reports in the last week in CNN that the U.S. managed to, behind closed doors, come to a deal with Russia about, at least temporarily, about certain further escalatory steps, because it is reported, this was CNN, that Russia was about to provide long-range anti-ship missiles to the Houthis, our Ansar movement in Yemen, which is allied with Iran and has been targeting Israeli and Western shipping through the Red Sea off the coast of Yemen for months now. And all attempts by the U.S. and the United Kingdom and recently Israel itself to stop those attacks with airstrikes and cruise missile strikes have been like playing whack-a-mole in the desert. And extremely ineffective. And it is also discussed that Russia has already been providing satellite and other C4ISR data to the Houthis to assist in their targeting of Western aircraft. That itself would, of course, be extremely useful. And at least some U.S. sources are crediting that with the success that the Houthis have had in targeting shipping and, by some accounts, chasing off U.S. military aircraft, surface craft, including possibly an aircraft carrier, out of the theater there. But then again, Russia also gets blamed for everything that goes wrong with the West. So whether it's true or not, we're putting it out there and you can consider it.
Right. And I'm glad that you bring up those reports because I had been looking into them earlier today. And I was actually surprised by how little talk there is of this in the American media, the mainstream media more specifically, because these are two of their favorite bad guys, Russia and Iran. I'm surprised that they're not taking this and really running with it, even if they are having to,
give them time. We'll probably see it in the Times in the morning.
Exactly. They'll catch up to it. But what this is spelling out to me is basically World War III, right? It's the increase of what we've already seen in Ukraine. It's also a reminder of kind of what we saw years ago in Syria, where you had the US trying to overthrow the government there. You had Russia come in and say, no, we're not doing this, and we're actually going to target ISIS, which the US clearly was not doing, as we saw by the fact that the elimination of ISIS came about after Russia got involved. But when it comes to the current situation that we're in, and the fact that you've got Iran ready to respond, you've got Israel, exactly as you were saying there. I mean, they're already talking about preemptive strikes, and we're in this situation because of the assassinations that they carried out in the first place. So, what are the concerns about this continuing to escalate and being a very literal World War III scenario where you have the US and its Western buddies on one end with Israel, and then you have Iran with its allies like Russia on the other side?
Okay, so I mean, let's address the idea of this. Definitely the possibility, almost the certainty of major escalation, possibly a regional conflagration is there. But is it really a World War III scenario? No and yes. First of all, it's true that Israel in the past 2 weeks has targeted Iran and Lebanon and Syria and Yemen, right? I mean, it's hit at least 4 countries in the region. I would be surprised if they haven't managed to hit Iraq at some point in there as well, going after militant groups. So, I mean, that is already obviously Israel trying to start off a major regional conflagration that the intent almost 100% is to draw the U.S. into it. Now, does that make it a World War III scenario, or does that make it a regional conflagration? I would argue the latter. Russia and China both have strategic partnerships with Iran, but at least as of the moment, they don't include a Article 5 type mutual defense agreement. So while they will certainly continue trade with Iran, it is unlikely that either Russia or China would become directly involved in the conflict unless there was some type of existential threat to the Iranian state, which is extremely unlikely. We're not going to see 1 million U.S. soldiers storming Tehran, right? That's not. This is going to be a war of long-range strikes and perhaps covert warfare by proxy groups back and forth. But this isn't going to be large, clashing militaries on the ground or invasions of each other's countries. So it's unlikely to present an existential threat. Therefore, Russia and China would not get directly involved. However, they certainly would and possibly already are providing degrees of military assistance, like satellite data, like possibly this discussion of electronic warfare and possibly missile supplies. But as we know from the U.S. and Western support for the Kiev proxy regime, you can provide everything under the sun to another country, but it doesn't mean that you're involved in the conflict at all, right? I mean, that's what they say when they do it. This may be a chance for Russia and China to respond with a little bit of that. Now, on the other hand, you could take a look at this and say, from a future perspective, we may look and see a long string of interconnected conflicts whose common denominator is resistance to U.S.-led Western global hegemony. Whether we're talking the conflict in Ukraine, the frozen conflict in Syria, now an extension of the Ukrainian conflict out in Mali with Wagner and Ukrainian forces getting involved there, and now this conflagration here that certainly the U.S. and Russia are behind opposing powers. This is more being Israel and Iran. This is more properly a more traditional proxy conflict where there's 1 degree remove on each side. But in the future, people may look back at this and say that this string of conflicts were World War III, happening in, shall we say, in slow motion, as it were. So that's why I say no and yes.
Okay, I think that's a fair answer, and yeah, it's interesting to see how we continue to be in kind of that push and pull, where in one moment it's like, okay, are we on the slope to World War III? Right? Is this heating up to the point where we're headed there? And then it kind of backs off, but yet
it's a roller coaster.
It really is. Not leading anywhere good, but it is a roller coaster. Now, the last thing that I want to ask you about is, of course, the latest coming out of Ukraine. It seems like Zelensky is feeling a little bit forgotten with everything else going on in the world. I mean, he just got his first batch of F-16 fighter jets. He got to announce it and confirm it, and no one cares. But it almost seems like no one cares because they know that this is not going to be the game changer that the West initially made it sound like it was going to be. So now you have Zelensky even accusing the West of being too fearful of escalation with Russia. Has he not figured out that this fear may actually be a healthy fear because the West knows that if they get to that point, it's not going to look good for them?
Yeah, so after, a couple of years of pressure and wrangling and arguments, the West has finally provided 6 old F-16s to Ukraine, and Zelensky posed, on the ground with 2 Ukrainian repainted F-16s behind him and 2 more flying over the sky. And we know from at least U.S. sources in the Biden administration have been telling the New York Times that Ukraine now presumably has 6 F-16s that have been delivered around that, and they've got about 6 barely trained, not really trained pilots, that at least could probably sit in it and turn it on. How much more they're capable of isn't clear yet. But if there's a big yawn to this, a major new conflict involving Israel certainly gathers a lot of U.S. Political intention. But we've also heard from the U.S. Defense Secretary, from the U.S. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, from the Kiev regime's own top general Sersky last week in The Guardian, all saying that these F-16s are not a game changer. They're not going to change the status quo on the battlefield, which is not a status quo. It's a Russian advance. And that their primary role is going to be to hide in Western Ukraine, well away from the front line, from the contact line, and from Russian far superior air defense and Russia's own much more advanced air force, and be used primarily in a defensive capacity as an assistance to the Kiev regime's faltering air defense, trying to shoot down cruise missiles in Western Ukraine, which is to say that, for all the trouble and the expense, these F-16s are more of a political gesture than they are any real serious military wonderwaff that's going to change the course of the conflict. That's probably why there's a bit of a yawn as Zelensky does everything he can to divert world attention back to himself, being the absolute prima donna that he is.
Yeah, I'll never forget in the aftermath of October 7th when Zelensky suggested that he needed to go to Israel to really draw more attention to them. And it's like, no,
and Netanyahu was like,
right.
No.
He's like, oh, you haven't figured this out. You think the world revolves around you. That's not how this works. The Western world, well, they revolve around their one ally, and that is not good news for Zelensky. Certainly a lot at stake here all around, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down the latest here. International relations and security analyst Mark Sleboda, thanks so much for your time and insight.
Thanks for having me.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. If you want to support my work, you can also check out my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/rachelblevins. That's where you can sign up as a monthly paid subscriber and join the community there. As always, thank y'all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.